Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this virtual series of conference at Hertie School of Governance in Berlin about the future of democracy promotion after Afghanistan. I like to greet people who are with us for the first two round of talks and to greet the newcomers as well. And of course, to greet our very distinguished speakers that kindly accepted to be with us and engage in this dialogue tonight. They are Thomas Carothers, old mentor and friend of mine. He has been for many years the vice president in charge of studies at Carnegie Endowment, and he is currently actually the interim president of this prestigious organization. Tom has written, is basically the pioneer of democracy studies, of democracy promotion studies, and his book, Aiding Democracy, I think was the first book bought by the Hertie School Library when this institution was created. I still recall the completely empty shelves when I was first hired here, but we had like 30 copies of Tom's book. Richard Youngs also is associated with Carnegie, but with Carnegie Europe. He's also associated with the University of Warwick. And he is the European scholar working on democracy promotion. There are a few other people to have made this topic the focus of their work. And of course, you know, one is placed in DC, the other one is placed in Brussels. And of course, the theme of this evening would be to discuss the transatlantic approaches after this Afghanistan sort of change of history moment. And we are going to start with the fairly provocative question, but which is very much on a lot of people's minds these days, in particular if those people are democracy activists in many countries. Is democracy promotion a policy of the future? Is this something going to go on, perhaps in a different form than the one that we knew for the past 20 years? But what would you expect to happen on one hand, and what would you want to see happening? What would actually be your preference? What do you think should happen? Because I realize that this might be two different things, right? Your realistic expectations and what you, as people who have observed this field and worked within this field for a lifetime, would feel that in fact we should do after this rather difficult moments. Tom, I will start with you, if possible. Seniority, if you do not mind.
Thank you, Alina. Well, thanks for hosting this gathering. It's always great to be with you. I've had the chance to be at Hertie before in person. I've always enjoyed your presence there and your wonderful students and the general atmosphere there. So I'm sorry we can't do this in person, but it's great to do it virtually. You've got a lot of questions packed into one big opening question there, Alina. So let me start by taking part of it, which is this a policy of the past? Is this kind of the end of an era for democracy promotion? I think is what, in a sense, part of what you're asking. And I would say that no, it's not. That the withdrawal from Afghanistan, chaotic and poorly planned, poorly executed, and disgraceful and embarrassing in many ways, and a humanitarian and political disaster, which it was in many ways, does not signal the end of democracy promotion as a US policy. Because Afghanistan was, in a way, not really a democracy promotion effort. It was a military intervention based on counterterrorism objectives, which became a political mission. And it was exceptional in the landscape of US democracy promotion efforts around the world. Most such efforts do not involve military intervention. And most of them involve some mix of diplomacy, like pressuring Myanmar's generals to back away from their coup. It involves a lot of assistance in many countries. It involves multilateral engagement and much else. And a lot of that, most of it, is continuing under the Biden administration. And the Biden folks are trying to upgrade democracy promotion's place in US policy. If anything, Alina, to be equally provocative back to you, I would say rather than being kind of chastened, the US democracy community in some ways is surprisingly unchastened and surprisingly determined to keep doing what they've been doing in many parts of the world, despite a lot of apparent failures. And I think we're going to talk about where those feelings of failure come from on the part of many people. And so if anything, it's kind of surprising here in Washington how much within the circles that I and others move in the kind of democracy space, if you will, there's a sense of let's just keep moving forward. And one might almost ask, why isn't there more a sense of turning the page or asking some fundamental questions? And I just say further, in question you asked me by email is this just, are we now in an era of a return to geopolitics away from democracy promotion? I'd say, don't forget, Alina, that democracy promotion was born out of geopolitics in the 1980s. The effort in the United States to build an edifice of democracy policy, both diplomatically and in assistance terms, was a product of geopolitics, of anti-Soviet rivalry and policies. And if anything, the 1990s and early 2000s were kind of an unusual period of low geopolitics in which democracy promotion tried to be a bit free of geopolitics. But the return in recent years to the rivalry with China and with Russia actually motivates a lot of democracy promoters to say we're once again on the main stage of US policy, because if we want to push back against China and push back against Russia, that's all about supporting democracy. So in a way, there's a bit of a U-shaped curve here in the role of geostrategy and democracy promotion. We're back to combining democracy policy and geostrategy. Not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing per se, we can talk about that. So in short, it's not a policy of the past. It's clearly a policy of the future. We'll talk about what that might mean. It's not a return to a geopolitics ending democracy promotion, but more to geopolitics fueling new types of democracy support.
Thank you very much. All that is good news for us. I remember I taught a class on democracy promotion. The last class I taught this was in November, when American elections were on, and we were the day before Mr. Trump got elected. And I had guests from German Marshall Fund and from National Endowment for Democracy in the same time. Okay, so this was 4 in the afternoon. And we were very apprehensive in the class. And we said, okay, but we think Trump will win. And that was, and then I said, I hope it's not the last class of democracy promotion ever taught in the world, again. So that was definitely the end of the world feeling, the second day in particular. But now I'm glad that you tell me that, despite setbacks, actually in DC, the mood is not at all, but it's rather a restart kind of feeling. What about the mood in Brussels, Richard?
Well, also a pleasure to link up with you again, Alina. Thanks for the invitation. I think actually on the European side, the picture is very similar to the picture that Tom describes for the US. And I think on these issues, the US and EU are actually not parting ways from each other in any fundamental sense. European democracy policy clearly faces a lot of serious challenges that it's not come anywhere near to overcoming yet. But I don't think it's a policy of the past. It's not a dead policy. It's certainly not moribund. And I agree with Tom, also on the European side, Afghanistan will have a serious impact. I'm not sure it's the definitive game changer for European policy in these areas. European democracy policy functions at lots of different levels. I think at least at some of those levels, European policy is actually strengthening and has shown signs of improvement in the last few years. Certainly this EU leadership has a stronger rhetorical commitment to democracy and human rights. There's lots of new strategies and policy documents that attach a lot of priority to democratic issues. The EU is using more sanctions related to human rights than it's ever used before. The amounts of money going into democracy assistance on the ground have actually increased slightly in recent years. They're still not huge amounts compared to other areas of development spending, but they certainly haven't disappeared altogether. And policymakers would say also that they've begun to fine-tune the ways in which these amounts of money are spent as well. I think if there is one area of European policy that has diminished, it is precisely on the side of military intervention. I think a decade or 15 years ago, there was an interest in trying to build democracy programs in a more systematic way to the EU security mission, the so-called CSDP missions. I think today, if you look at the precise way in which CSDP missions take place, they're much more focused on traditional security issues, counterterrorism and the like. And the democracy elements of those missions are a lot thinner, a lot more modest than they used to be. And I think with what's happened in Iraq and then Libya, Syria, and with Afghanistan, I think this simply pushes the EU further in this direction of trying to de-link to some extent the democracy building agenda from the security-driven issues of military intervention. So I think that's the area where we do see some steps back. And as Tom said, we can debate whether that's an overdue and benign change or whether it's more problematic. And I would just say finally on the geopolitical question, I think here is where the situation in Europe is a little bit different from the US. We all know that traditionally, the EU has tried to downplay the geopolitical dimension of democracy support much more than has been the case with the EU, than with the US. But this is beginning to change. So we all know in the last couple of years, the EU has begun to develop this narrative about being a geopolitical player, about prioritizing its own power, its own interests, reclaiming European sovereignty, reclaiming strategic autonomy and the like. So this level of policy is now kind of superimposed on top of these more traditional elements of democracy support. And to my mind, it's still not clear what all this means for European democracy support. Most of these terms are so ambiguous that policymakers can read into them whatever they like. So some policymakers would say that this more geopolitical identity that the EU is developing is actually an impulse to more democracy support. Others would say it actually risks undermining all the good work the EU is doing on democracy and human rights. And say in Ukraine, one might think that there the geopolitical push has given democracy support greater dynamism, whereas in the Middle East, clearly the geopolitical dynamic has undercut any support for democracy and human rights. So I think the dynamics differ between different countries, but basically, in sum, I think I would say that they're very similar trends in Europe to what Tom describes in the US. And almost paradoxically, the very gravity of problems facing global democracy has kind of pushed at least some in the EU into a slightly stronger effort to defend core democratic values.
Into stronger rhetorics to promote democratic values so far, right? So, but let's deconstruct the terms here a little bit, because do we mean and understand the same things by democracy promotion? I mean, maybe this here is where we should start in trying to narrow down and to see what these particular political actors understand by democracy promotion. I would meanwhile ask participants to use the chat options to start asking questions, also to share links which might be relevant from their work, relevant to this discussion. Please go ahead. I will read the chat and pick up the best questions and introduce in the conversation. So, okay, mood is actually not depressed. We're going to do even more democracy promotion in the future. But then why did President Biden said so clearly? I heard him that it is the end of state building. Okay, what does he understand by this? And if democracy promotion is not state building, okay, so let's make a little bit of difference. What is the democracy promotion that we keep for the future? And what is the democracy promotion that we throw overboard together with Afghanistan?
You know, Alina, over the weekend, I was meeting with somebody at the State Department, a relatively senior official at the State Department, and I was pressing him a little bit. And I said, so are you guys really interested in democracy support or not? Come on, just tell me the truth. And he said, oh, Tom, he says, well, we're certainly interested in supporting democracy globally. We just don't want to promote democracy globally. And I said, wow, let me get my mind around that. And so we talked about what he means by that. And I think what he means by that, which I think is a sentiment somewhat shared in the Biden team, is there are two meanings to the word promote that they're uncomfortable with. One is the implication that we would intervene militarily and associate the democracy agenda with military interventions of the type that we're seeing in Iraq and Afghanistan and even Libya. And so promoting in the sense of forcible regime change. Don't do that anymore. But the other was a slightly broader sense, which was we won't try to kind of push it on countries that are nowhere near it and sort of feel that every country is supposed to become democratic in the world. The 1990s enthusiasm of feeling that everybody should be part of this, it'll be a bit more selective and a little less sort of confident and enthusiastic that everybody should join this bandwagon. So I think it's a somewhat more constrained view of between sort of promoting in a 1990s both optimistic but also sometimes use of military force sense, but nevertheless democracy support. So they're trying to greatly increase the budget for democracy assistance, which they regard as kind of a foundational sort of thing you do in a lot of places. They're trying to impose more sanctions, similarly to the EU. They've imposed quite a few sanctions related to democracy and rights since they came to power. They're trying to step up their engagement multilaterally. They're hosting this big summit on December 9th and 10th, Summit for Democracy. So all of these things for them are support, as distinguished a bit from promotion.
Very interesting. So we should be more selective, and also we should refine this vocabulary a little bit and speak from now on about supporting democracy rather than promoting democracy. And what about us, Richard, in Europe? I mean, Poland is starting to build a wall with Belarus, right? This is a little bit strange, seeing that Belarus is the country nearest to Europe, which is where people really fight for democracy these days. What does this tell us about us? I mean, that's a difficult situation for Europeans.
And by chance, I'm actually calling in from Poland right now, and that you're right, that is the issue dominating all the political debate here. I guess European policymakers would say that they're very familiar with the story that Thomas just told about the trend in US policy, and they would feel they've probably taken quite a number of steps along that path that he describes over the last decade. They already made the shift from talking about democracy promotion to democracy support. I think most in Europe would have probably already stepped back from this really ambitious state building enterprise. Not many people in Europe felt entirely comfortable with that whole terminology of regime change. And indeed, they probably moved to this slightly more selective approach. I mean, clearly where the EU's had no traction at all is in opening up political space in the really big authoritarian regimes like China and Russia. It struggled to have any traction in the states that have made really dramatic regression back into authoritarian states like Turkey. But I think where the set of European policy instruments does come into play and is still quite relevant, countries that make democratic breakthroughs and then go through this very difficult kind of valley of tears that all countries go through in trying to consolidate democratic institutions. I think that's where European policymakers would feel that they come in and they can offer a kind of quite broad range of policy instruments that helps build capacity and incentivizes democratic reformers on the ground in these kinds of countries. Of course, even there, the record isn't brilliant. There are countries that move quite in quite a positive way and quite far along the curve of democratic consolidation, can then look very fragile and even begin to go backwards, even after they've received huge amounts of European funding, European diplomatic attention, conditionality and pressure as well. So, but I think if Tom is right that the US is beginning to move in this direction, again, I would make the argument that far from parting ways on the democracy agenda, in fact, it may be that the European side and the American side are actually coming together, at least in some respects, around this slightly more selective agenda, an agenda which perhaps has a slightly lower degree of ambition. I wouldn't say it's exactly, the mood is exactly positive, Alina, but I think there is a feeling that if we can kind of focus in on a more selective range of goals, tailor our level of ambition more appropriately to the political circumstances we find around the world, then there is still a positive future for this kind of work.
Alina, if I might just stick in just for a minute, Alina, sorry, is that just to build on what Richard said, is I also wouldn't describe the mood here in Washington as positive in many ways. It's sober. It's not positive in two ways on the democracy agenda. First, there's a sense that, well, if you read Anne Applebaum's latest piece in The Atlantic of a few days ago, basically the theme of it is the authoritarians are winning. The general feeling is that the US is facing some very significant rivalry and pushback and assertiveness on the part of China and Russia and other authoritarian regimes. And while we dribble out a little bit of money on international broadcasting, China and Russia have invested very heavily in international broadcasting with some notable successes, I would say, and many other fronts. So first, there's not optimism that we're meeting the challenge. And second, the democracy community here is well aware, painfully aware of the problems in US democracy, systemic problems of adherence to democratic norms by some political actors and so forth, and well aware that the United States is in some ways hobbled or even crippled in its international image with respect to democracy as it works abroad. So it isn't a triumphal moment by any means, but it is a continuing commitment on the part of this community, even taking on board these considerable elements of caution or even pessimism about some aspects of it.
Right, but let me put it a bit like this. I mean, it's always been some sort of geographical division of labor, and the US has always considered that it's Europe who has to take care of some areas, even if it didn't work very well in the past, like the European neighborhood, for instance, right? Well, we have these situations in European neighborhood. We have Tunisia, for instance. Yesterday, the European Parliament passed a resolution on Tunisia, but I mean, I had to scroll through pages to arrive at the last line on that resolution. And even only there, it says that we call for a return to parliamentary democracy, whatever. I mean, is the EU really able to send a stronger signal than this? What should we do on Tunisia, Richard? Okay, I don't think Americans are going to come and sort this Tunisian case for us. And I don't need to remind either of you that it was the only success case or some sort of semi-success case that we had out of this whole, Arab Spring pro-democracy revolutions. And we lost it. What are the European democracy promoters doing these days?
Yeah, and actually, it's not just Tunisia. There are several cases in the East as well that democratized to quite a significant extent and now seem to be, if they're not autocratizing, certain elements of their politics are becoming more autocratic. The Armenian revolution is unraveling a little bit, not least in relation to the conflict with Azerbaijan. Things in Georgia don't look too good. Ukraine is fragile. These are I mention these countries because they're countries where the EU has funneled in a lot of money, where it has developed quite a systematic use of democracy-related conditionality. So it's not been soft, it's not just channeled in money without thinking about where the money is going. And yet, these cases have not proven complete successes. I mean, it's not for me to defend the EU's record in these countries, but if you're a policymaker, some of the tactical decisions are quite difficult. In Carnegie, we're actually just preparing a paper precisely on the crisis in Tunisia. And it's interesting, many Tunisian civil society representatives are a little bit skeptical about the EU coming in with very heavy sanctions, that the political settlement, the political class in Tunisia had actually lost a lot of popularity. So what happened on the July the 25th does have a degree of popular support. And the fear is that if the EU was to be too tough and completely cut off its support, that could actually backfire. One would think that the amount of money that the EU has pumped into a place like Tunisia, where it did operate this policy of positive conditionality after the democratic revolution, the very fact that Tunisia was the one success story of the Arab Spring meant it attracted a huge increases in EU support. So the EU has leverage to play with. There are other elements of the EU's policy that haven't been so helpful. The big tool the EU had was its free trade talks with Tunisia. This is what Tunisians really wanted, to get access to European markets. the EU's rather overloaded the trade deal with a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of economic conditions that are designed to be to the EU's own self-interest rather than thinking what would benefit the situation in Tunisia. Likewise with its security cooperation in Tunisia, the migration policy. These are all elements that kind of cut across all the investment that the EU has put into Tunisia and suggest that ultimately still in these kind of cases, there's a layer of security concerns and economic concerns that still sit above the concerns with democracy and democratic transitions. To finish, I would say, and it'd be interesting to have Tom's view, and as he's the person who's written more on this than anybody else, I think a weakness certainly of European policy is this, that the EU does respond quite categorically when there is a military coup or when there's a really dramatic and absolute interruption of democratic processes. It's quite bad at preempting democratic decay. So Tunisians will tell you that things were going wrong in Tunisia already from 2 or 3 years ago. And the EU's, I think, quite bad at spotting these kinds of deteriorations and trying to head them off, reacting in time. It tends to wait too late until it's then more difficult to do something about these emerging problems. So I think one thing the democracy community does need to learn to do is to react more quickly when these very subtle, nuanced challenges to democracy are beginning to mount, even though they don't appear to be particularly dramatic problems in that moment. Time and time again, we see the same with Georgia now and the crisis blowing up there. We see the EU not responding and then having to consider quite far-reaching policy options when things do begin to go more seriously wrong.
Okay, before I pass to Tom, Richard, I'm going to push you a little bit still here. Why can't we frame this rather differently? Why can't we say that EU was spending a considerable amount of money in Tunisia, not reaching the good governance goals that we had? I was looking at corruption, could see very well that things weren't going anywhere. We were adopting 5-year corruption plans, which never changed the country. It's simply not the way to go about this kind of things. And now when there is really the opportunity to do something which is easier than building good governance, because all it would take is attitude, is expressed clearly, where EU preference lies, we're not doing much. I don't hear, and the more months are going to go past, the more difficult it will be to revert to parliamentary democracy. The same thing in Georgia. Yes, it's long-term erosion, but Saakashvili is in jail. Now this is really an opportunity for very, very decisive kind of talk of diplomatic reaction from the side of the EU. If I understand correctly, this is not going to happen. This is your forecast.
Well, no, the EU, again, it's not for me to defend the EU, but they would say behind the scenes, they are exerting pressure, particularly in the Saakashvili case, because it's so dramatic. Georgia is quite sobering because there the EU has threatened to cut off the money, and it's the Georgian government that's actually turned around even before the EU actually imposed sanctions or cut the aid formally, turned around and said, actually, we don't want the money, we prefer to do without the money. So there is a concern that Tunisia might do the same. I'm not disagreeing with you, Elena. I'm not defending what the EU's done. It spent a lot of money. Clearly, it's not spent that money in a way that has gained sufficient impact to defend against these kind of regressions back away from democracy. There is a question of whether, even if the EU in these kind of cases has perfectly designed policies, whether it is actually in the gift of the EU to prevent these things from happening. I think, again, that speaks to perhaps our ambitions needing to be a little bit lower. But I think Tunisia is a real test case. I think if the president now doesn't commit to the promised roadmap back to democracy and democratic elections, if his power grab deepens and persists over time, then I would suspect the EU will begin to contemplate firmer measures. But I also think I'll leave it there, but I think there's a broader question about whether what's not working is actually democracy support or the lack of democracy support. But
Richard, would you say, is this a fair argument? This sounds a bit like the dark empire in Washington looking at the EU and commenting on it. But would you say that the Europeans tend to have an approach within the European Union of a consensus-based group of states, which tends to try to get along and to smooth over problems, whether it's systemic corruption in Greece in the 1990s and 2000s, Hungary's backward drift starting about 10 or 12 years ago. And then when European diplomacy and aid extends out to the European neighborhoods of the South and the East, they tend to bring the same approach of let's assume the best, assume a positive path, try to take a friendly approach. And that kind of approach makes it hard to say things are starting to go bad. It's time to draw a red line here and say, you know what, beyond this line, we can't continue this policy of friendship. There's a kind of, the United States doesn't have a similar kind of consensual neighborhood that it's part of. And so when it relates to other states on democracy issues, it doesn't extend from an experience like that out. So for example, when Nicaragua starts to go downhill, which it's done rather dramatically in recent years, the United States resorts more to 20th century kind of, we don't like you anymore, take this, slash, sanctions, whack, because that's kind of the United States is used to doing that in its neighborhood. So it's sort of, I'm not praising the US approach or criticizing the European one, but when Americans watch European approaches to both Eastern and Southern neighborhoods, it looks like it's an extension of an EU approach to be very consensual and soft and assume the best until suddenly it's too late.
Yes, I mean, and the difference.
Yeah. Question is, are we back to the 90s? Today there was a gentleman, a professor in Sarajevo all day on Euronews saying that Europe has entirely lost control of what goes on in Bosnia and calling for Americans to send NATO back to occupy Bosnia to prevent the separation of Republika Srpska and the return. And this really sounds like the 90s now, when this was European backyard and Europe was supposed to take care of it. But then out of the sudden, locals start asking for Americans to come back because they feel that Europe cannot handle it. So Bosnia, which is now very much within Europe, is not even in the neighborhood. It's an accession country.
I mean, I think the problem on the European side is exactly as Tom describes, this tendency to look for opportunities to bring people together and negotiate solutions. That's what the EU did actually in Georgia now. It sent a big team with the council president to negotiate an accord that seemed to be sticking for a while. And then it fell apart. And in Tunisia, the support was based around Tunisia's kind of famed consensual model of transition. So it seemed to be working with the grain. So that's the problem. But I think there's an additional problem, and that is that the EU's policy instruments seem to be a bit blunter today than they used to be. The difference between the US's immediate neighborhood in Latin America and the EU's immediate neighborhood is that the EU is not a nation state, so it has traditionally worked by trying to integrate parts of those economies, political systems, and social systems into the EU space. And in many cases, that has had traction and has contributed positively to democratization, even if it has not absolutely guaranteed full democratic development and consolidation. The trouble is, it seems to me that the EU is designing a lot of these instruments in a way that foreground its own interests now and doesn't really think through how they serve as instruments of democracy support. I mean, in the case of Tunisia, the really powerful policy instrument the EU had a decade ago was to promise Tunisia to integrate Tunisia into the EU's economic space, which it did through, I mean, this gets a bit technical, but to negotiate this deep and comprehensive free trade area that's more than a free trade area. It's giving Tunisia virtual kind of de facto membership of many areas of the EU single market. And 10 years on, those negotiations are stalled because in the end, Tunisian elites calculated they weren't really to the interest of the Tunisian economy. And the same with countries to the east as well, with all the free trade agreements and the association agreements. They've been accepted to a point, but they haven't really worked to reform the underlying kind of governance structures that you were talking about, Alina, or to reform politics in any kind of systematic way. So it's the policy instruments as well. It's not, Tom, it's not just this unwillingness to see problems.
Okay, but this is really like assisting long-term transformations. But now we have dramatic developments. Now we have dramatic developments in these countries. We have coup against parliament. We have arrests of people. I mean, this is no longer calling for this kind of instruments. This simply calls for very clear diplomatic intervention. And this is, you know, so how is this going to work? Are we going to do it by ourselves as Europeans? Are we going to call in the Americans and do it jointly, or nobody's going to do it? Some of them because they're too far from this, and others because it's complicated. Tom, please. What should we do? Okay, do you think there is any coordination on responses these days?
Well, I agree with you that when reversals hit, and there's been a lot of reversals just in this year. You know, recently I was talking with someone on the White House team who works on democracy, and we were talking about the run of coups in different countries, whether it's Guinea or Sudan or Myanmar. And she said she's only been in the job since January. Does every year have so many coups? Is this always like this? Because my job is just going from coup to coup, she said. And I said, well, you're in a phase, we're in a period of significant reversals in a number of countries. And democracy policy, as you say, Alina, right now is not in the mode of long-term iterative transformation. It's more like firefighting, where this house bursts into fire over here, and you only have 2 fire trucks, and now this house bursts into fire over here. And how do you spend your diplomatic capital and political energy on these different cases? Is Mali as important as Guinea? Is that as important as Sudan? What to do on Myanmar, et cetera, Georgia and Tunisia and many others. So it's been, I would say, hard to change gears and to move to a policy that's more pointed and more crisis oriented. They've usually this year resorted to the sanctions tool and imposed targeted sanctions on specific individuals engaged in coups, trying to use this as a lever. I think that's an okay policy, and also visa sanctions of different types. I think that's okay, but it's only, you know, part of a policy of really having a serious playbook for how you respond to specific reversals and crises like that. But I think, you know, they've certainly become aware of it, and I think they're trying to up their game. For example, one new preoccupation of the democracy community here in Washington, at the White House and the State Department elsewhere, is the rise of transnational repression. Again and again this year, we've seen repressive states reach across borders into the, you know, sovereign territory of other countries to repress activists, to strike against people who may have left the country seeking refuge somewhere else. And this really ups the game, you know, in terms of democratic backsliding. When it's not just something that takes place within Georgia or within Nicaragua, it becomes, you know, an octopus that reaches anywhere in the world and strikes against an activist. So this is an example of a, you know, a structural change in democratic backsliding that requires, you know, upping your game and responding and trying to mobilize countries to say, we have to take a tougher line when somebody gets killed in our own country, who's clearly the target of political assassination based on another country. We have to not just treat this as a discrete murder, but as a, you know, an example of something we are going to say is totally unacceptable. We're going to push back on, get alliance with others, and really, you know, speak about it as what it is, which is a new transnational phenomenon that needs to be combated. So the democracy community needs to go from, you know, responding to crises, getting ready for that and assuming there's going to be a crisis every month, and then also seeing the systematic forms these crises are taking, like transnational repression, and developing the kind of diplomatic instruments and energy to combat them.
Well, on this line, I mean, yes, please, Richard. Are Europeans contemplating resorting more to sanctions? I mean, sanctions in particular, since we're speaking about, you know, about Russia, there's no secret to anybody. Russia money launders its money through Europe. Its oligarchs buy real estate in Berlin and in London. We could really hurt them if we would, you know, coordinate with Americans and deny visas and financial heavens to such kind of people, shouldn't we?
I mean, the EU, like the US, is reaching for the sanctions tool quite frequently now, and not just the EU, but also the UK, Switzerland, Norway. So this is becoming quite a regularly used policy instrument. The evidence is a little bit patchy on what impact these restrictive measures actually have, and now they're being extended as well. There's lots of proposals on due diligence, targeting the financial sector, so on and so forth. So I think that trend will grow. I basically agree with you, Alina, that when we get to these kind of situations that we're seeing now in Tunisia, Georgia, and other cases like this, there is a case for putting on the table either sanctions or, if not sanctions, steps that would reduce aid going to such governments. The EU is beginning to look at this. The trend is not, what's happening is aid isn't being withdrawn completely from countries, but being redirected away from governments into civil society in a practical way that's quite difficult to do. But there are tools that the EU's developed to try and execute that kind of response. So I'd expect that to grow in the future. But I would make one broader...
Just a second here, because we have a very good question related to this on the chat, which is, yes, I think we probably all agree that the part of democracy promotion that we must salvage is support for civil society and democracy activists who want our support. But how do we do that? Because this new authoritarian regime have closed the possibility for external funding in ways which were, not thinkable in the early 90s, where we could really reach people and give grants everywhere. So is there a plan here? How are we going to support civil societies in the case of these reversal situations that we now have? And, places where explicitly people like in Russia or in Egypt do not allow civil society being funded from outside. What can we do?
I'm happy to let Richard provide the answer to that, although I have a few thoughts.
I think here the challenge has got a...
This came from the chat, by the way. It's not me. But
I think here the challenge has become very, very severe. I mean, this is not the EU's fault or the US's fault. And I think the democracy community hasn't responded in a way that's commensurate with this challenge. So the terrain on which we're operating, or they are operating, is very much more difficult. But I think at the same time, this is a level at which policy has changed and has evolved. So today there are different ways of spending this kind of money. More money is going to informal civil society groups, or even individual bloggers, exile groups. It's going to organizations outside countries that then can get money more surreptitiously into activists. It's helping activists come out of countries. It's providing legal support for them, digital security support, physical support. The rules for distributing this funding have changed. It's going in through kind of proxy organizations as well. It's going in through the European Endowment, so on and so forth. There's dozens of changes, small scale changes that have been made that try to address this problem.
That's a great answer. That's a great answer. So we fund democracy activists from that countries abroad, and they find informal ways of sending this support in the country. Well, makes a lot of sense. I mean, it works by subversion. How can one subvert dictators other than by a bit of subversion? Okay, then we cannot do it on transparent channels. So you meant to say something more about the EU approach, Richard, before I asked you in this.
Yeah, sorry, this may go off on a tangent a bit, but it strikes me as one important issue we haven't covered yet, that when we're discussing European approaches versus US approaches, and we're talking about these big EU tools, the instruments that the EU has that exist at the EU level, we shouldn't forget what's going on at the member state levels as well, because if you add up all the resources, the member states are still big players in this. And it strikes me there's two quite distinct problems. One problem is that all these EU tools in democracy support may be quite well developed and still quite well financed, but they're not having the impact we desire. But another problem is that many of the member states are simply not taking democracy policy very seriously. They're not doing very much in this area. And I think we should avoid conflating these two issues. We shouldn't ascribe to democracy support a kind of intrinsic failure, when actually the shortcoming is that many governments are actually not investing much in this area. So we've got two parallel problems. Some instances where the EU is investing at scale in democracy support and it doesn't seem to be working. And then you've got most member states doing a little bit in this area, but not really attaching much priority to it. And there, the problem is not democracy support intrinsically, it's the fact that only a limited amount of democracy support has even been tried by most European governments. So I think we just keep in mind that those two problems exist. It would seem a little bit or illogical to conclude that democracy support isn't working, when in fact the problem is that not much of it has been tried by most governmental actors?
Alina, I have to push myself into this and say I'm not comfortable with the word subversion that you used. You know, when people on the outside in Europe or the United States support, say, the right of Hong Kong protesters to protest, or the right of people in Hong Kong to maintain some of the rights that they had, which they're losing, that's not an effort to subvert the Chinese government. That's an effort to maintain fundamental freedoms that were partially enjoyed by those people, it's not an effort to subvert the Chinese government. We have to be careful, because if we use that language, we're playing into the very narrative that they're saying, that an effort to support rights is per se subversion, which has, of course, for good reasons, a very negative connotation in terms of what's permissible under international law. So I think we really should be careful. You know, in Belarus, Europe and the United States are standing for the right of Belarusians to have an election in which their choice is respected according to the laws and principles that Belarus has agreed to through a number of multilateral charters and international law. It is not trying to, quote, subvert the Belarusian government. It's trying to get the government to respect international law. So I think we really need to be careful here about our language.
Oh, no, you're perfectly right. However, from a perspective of a domestic activist who's sitting in any country, what I'm trying to do is to subvert the dictator who is above me, right? And if you support me, then definitely will leave us open to accusations of subversion. But you're absolutely right that yes, language has to be very careful these days as the space has reduced so dramatically. So, you know, let me try to move a little bit. We discussed about the selectivity, geographical selectivity, basically. We said we are moving into a new era of geographical selectivity. Some cases are very difficult, other cases. So we're going to select better where we do democracy support. Now, let me move to a different kind of selectivity. I mean, lessons learned from this Afghanistan, Iraq business, Balkans business. Are we going to be selective about areas as well? Are we going to go on with everything that we did? I mean, you definitely say human rights, that has to stay on. You know, elections, a number of other things, but is everything going to stay on? Are we going to try to build judiciaries in the future? Are we going to try to build control of corruption? Are we really going, and as Europeans says, you know, are we going to export values as part of democracy promotion? I mean, look how difficult it is in Poland. We're trying to convince the Polish peasants that it is actually a matter of human rights if LGBT people are allowed to marry or not. And they tell us that this was no part of the Copenhagen criteria by the time that they joined. They simply think that this is a different value, which is allowed, a sign of diversity in Europe. I again watch them today, how they answer to this. So, you know, from the smaller package to the very ambitious package, what worked better? What worked better, and what are we going to keep? Are we going on with everything, or a certain selectivity is also required on areas of democracy?
Well, I think one or two, you know, a couple of lessons that have been learned, not necessarily acted upon, is first that, you know, many of the large scale efforts to provide support for major governmental institutions like parliamentary strengthening, or as you say, judicial rebuilding, or, you know, judicial training. Many of those efforts, especially carried out in countries with rather dubious attachment to democracy, so say a large parliamentary strengthening program in Kazakhstan, or in Jordan, or in Pakistan. A lot of those programs have really proven to be not worthwhile, and if anything, window dressing that is unhelpful, compared to, say, a small, nimble, focused program on helping investigative journalists develop tools of the trade and carry out their work in those countries. I'd much rather spend $5 million on investigative journalists than $50 million on parliamentary exchanges for Kazakhstan. So I think there is some learning that these large-scale efforts, which were based on a model of assumed transition, in which we were just helping those institutions get to where we hoped they were getting to, we now realize are not realistic in the face of democratic backsliding. We need to focus our efforts on more agents of change rather than agents of stasis. And I think there is some learning, but the bureaucratic mechanisms behind those programs, as you know, Alina, are hard to combat. The second kind of focus is to think about the fact that what really drives democratic decline in many places is citizen anger that then fuels illiberalism. And so Brazilians are very angry about political corruption for good reason. But unfortunately, they vote in a person who says he's going to clean house and smash judicial independence and break all the rules to do that. That's not a good outcome of that. And so what you have to do is we should have been giving more attention earlier on in Brazil to why are citizens white hot with anger over this corruption issue. And maybe instead of focusing on lots of the other things in Brazil, put your finger on what is driving the citizen anger and try to respond to that rather than assuming an institutional template approach. Instead, zero in on why are Tunisians so angry with the system they have, and let's concentrate our efforts like that, because that anger often turns into anti-democratic impulse, as we see in Tunisia, in India, actually, in Brazil and elsewhere. So those are two ways in which, away from the big governmental programs to more focused efforts, and away from a kind of institutional template generally to a greater focus on what is the driving dynamic of politics in the country that might be dangerous.
So more phrase it like a policy problem and then look at this rather than coming up with a 5 years plan of building everything, yes, right, from whatever they have to our benchmarks. Yeah. Richard, would be great if you take up the part on promotion of values. Okay, I like to support what I said earlier, saying that I see only two camps in Europe. One is overwhelming, is the camp which says that we have to punish Poland and Hungary strongly. And the other one is the more pragmatic camp of Ivan Krastev and myself, who says you guys have always underestimated to what extent Eastern Europe is a rural, conservative society, which we brought in Europe without actually explaining to people, and updating them on the latest human rights. And this is why these dictators, these populist dictators in Eastern Europe have been so successful, because they can all immediately rally a conservative majority, and this conservative majority will simply allow them to do whatever they want on rule of law, because people don't care of this, because they feel that these people defend the Christian traditionalist values that a part of our rural populations stand for. Or in fact, I would stand for, it's a lot to say, that a part of our rural populations don't know any better. You understand that we have people who die every day. In Romania, 500 people die every day because they don't vaccinate themselves. 70% of Romanians are not vaccinated because their Orthodox priests tell them not to. Tell them that they're vaccinated with Christianism and therefore they should be immune. I mean, the evidence against comes every day, but it really doesn't matter. So, is it really productive not to try to win elections and promote values with sanctions?
I think that the values element of European policy is actually becoming stronger. Actually, as the EU moves away from this more institutional approach that Tom aptly describes. I think the democracy support community does need to do more, both within Europe and outside Europe, to disentangle support for core democratic values on the one hand from kind of socially liberal values on the other hand, and to demonstrate that supporting democracy isn't inimical to conservative values. Tom and I actually did a project on this, was it 2-3 years ago, Tom, where we looked at the emergence of these more kind of conservative civic groups around the world. And it is quite complicated, but there is a feeling amongst many that the democracy agenda has become seen as synonymous with a kind of liberalism that those people might not subscribe to, whether one agrees or disagrees with them. And therefore, in that way, the democracy agenda, I think, does need to adapt, both within Europe and outside Europe. So that's on the values. On the institutional agenda, I think what Tom describes is also the key change in European policy. The EU used to describe itself, or others used to describe the EU as a transformative power that felt that it could really get under the skin of societies and change social systems, economies, political systems in a really deep-seated structural way, because it could kind of integrate them into the European system. And I think that approach is lost traction a bit. It's not disappeared completely, but I'm not sure it's really the leading edge of European policy now. Despite all the talk of the kind of Brussels effect gaining ground, to me, it seems it's actually losing ground. Third countries are actually pushing back against it. So I don't think the democracy agenda can be part of this kind of wholesale transformative power in the future. I think Tom is right. What remains and what many European donors have become good at is focusing in on promising areas of civic activism, agents of change. It's a more agent-based rather than structure-based approach to political change, supporting them, defending them, keeping some space open for this kind of political activism. It's not easy to do. The EU doesn't have very good policy tools to engage with protests, for example. It's struggling to do that. It's looking at ways that it can kind of buy into this dynamic. Baby steps so far, but I think it does mark the shift of what Tom was describing from a kind of very institutionalized template of democracy support to a more actor-based template. And I think that will, and it comes back to what we were saying at the beginning, slightly lower ambition, not an ambition to transform the whole of third country societies and polities, but rather to keep open the opportunity for political change if and when it comes along.
Yeah, I find this a bit paradoxical because I see that the EU is trying to transform Hungary and Poland, and it's not really working. You know, instead of sort of cheating a little bit and helping oppositions there to win elections in a more strategic way, we are really trying to change overnight the values of people in Hungary and Poland. And it does seem to me that we have been at some years doing this and not very successfully. Tom, please. I have a question for you.
Okay, yeah,
you're thinking for your final. You had a very famous article in Journal of Democracy, one of the most famous articles ever written on democracy, about the end of transition paradigm. So you are probably the first to notice that there was this very optimistic conception that any time a political change happened somewhere or a dictator was falling anywhere, what would then have started was this kind of predetermined transition with steps leading up to the consolidation of democracy. And of course, you are right. And more and more, I mean, it turns out that these transitions stopped or reverted or whatever. Do we still have some transitions today? So do we still have countries where this piecemeal supportive approach could actually work? I mean, I'm thinking, for instance, Moldova is doing well. Richard mentioned Armenia negatively, but I would still say maybe Armenia still has a tradition. I mean, do we still have a few transitions where we can actually hope that, we have sufficient domestic agency that our help is incrementally getting to consolidation?
Yeah, that was 20 years ago, that article, Lina. So maybe gradually it's becoming true. It took a while, but a while ago, I was giving a talk in Argentina and people said, where are we on the transition to democracy? And I said, well, let's see, you started in about 1824. So by my calculation at the time, you're about 190 years into your transition. The United States is struggling. We're about 200 and some years into our transition. So, lots of countries are struggling. I think South Africa is still, despite the whole Zuma period and the terrible things that happened under Jacob Zuma as their leader, is trying to work out a path of change towards something better. South Africa is only one of a number of countries that really made a genuine transition away from an autocratic past to something that's better, that's significantly, struggling to move forward. I don't have time to name other countries, but I think there are plenty of countries that still have a process of iterative change that's worth supporting and trying to find the elements that are weakest or who's pushing most for positive changes. Many countries in sub-Saharan Africa and so forth. It could be in Tunisia that the presidential self-coup is a bump on the road, but not a fundamental U-turn. I think there's still significant elements in Tunisia that favor a positive outcome. So it isn't that iterative change per se is bad, it's the assumption of positivity that we had, that there's a naturalness to democratization. Democracy is, if anything, it's unnatural. Why should competing political sides step down when they win? So much more fun to step on your opponent and smash them further. It's very hard to have balanced political systems. Why not steal money if you can? It's so much fun to have all that money. Human instincts are not, naturally democratic, I don't think, in that sense. And so this assumption that we had in the 90s that democracy is like large boulders rolling down a hill into a valley of happiness, it's boulders trying to roll uphill against all of the instincts of human beings to steal, to cheat, to lie, to take power. I'm not saying humans are intrinsically evil, they're just very human. So democratization, if we see it as a very stubborn, difficult process, should make us feel like all of the setbacks over the last 30 years are actually entirely understandable. And so it shouldn't be surprising that 30 or 35 years into this domain, this enterprise, we're struggling so hard. Doesn't mean we've done it all wrong or should give up. It just means we have to give up all of those illusions and dig in and confront the problems one by one with a focus on agents of change, with realism and with persistence.
What would you, this is my last question really, because we unfortunately approach the end of this conversation. What would you like to see happening on the occasion of this December Democracy Summit? Do you have any expectations related to this? What would you like to happen? I mean, both of you, in terms of American partnership, now that we're back in an era of multilateralism, it's important also for us, Europeans, what is the direction that the Biden administration will give to this game of ours, the democracy support? So what are your expectations after this?
I'll just be quick and leave time for Richard. My expectations and my hopes are two different things, Alina. My expectations are rather modest. My hopes are still, maybe more extensive. My hopes would be that we come out of the summit with two or three things. One, a genuine sense that democracies of the world came together, recognized the difficult moment, and looked each other in the eye and said, we could work on this together. We could have some common values and stand for this internationally. That there's a real positive sense that this is a moment in time in history when countries recognize this. And second, that a number of important governments made some real commitments at the summit that they're willing to have scrutinized over the next year and reviewed a year from now and said, we said we'd try to do better on X, and we're willing to put that up for international scrutiny and come back a year from now and report on whether or not we made progress on X. Two simple things that I at least hope should be able to come out of this summit.
Richard?
I agree with that, and I would also add the hope that it doesn't become too much about China. The democratic community needs a fairly assertive pushback against China, but the concern with China shouldn't dominate the agenda. In my view, it'd be better to start off a long-term process of kind of quiet work of coordinating projects on the ground in places where democracy is under threat or where there may be opportunities for democracy, rather than it being a kind of very exclusive concert of democracies that becomes primarily about China. Firstly, and secondly, I think other democracies other than the US need to buy into this process fully. It's great that the US has kicked this off. I think the rest of us, rather than simply standing on the sidelines, criticizing or expressing doubts, need to step up and make a proactive contribution as well. And the US leaves space for other democracies, Korea, Japan, whatever, to come in and own the initiative as well, and not judge it too much just on the one summit, but see the summit as the beginning of what will be a long process of making this coordination more effective and operational.
Well, thank you very much. We will watch the summit and continue with this series of talk. Thanks everybody who watched us tonight. You can see us again if you read the recording on Facebook, which is going to be posted. Thank you. Thank our speakers who are absolutely great, and thank our audience. And until next time, greetings from Berlin.
Thank you, Alina. Wonderful to be with you. Bye.
Bye, Alina.